Retailers in BC, Saskatchewan, and Ontario say they aren't ready. Police forces say they aren't ready to use samples for drug-impaired driving, even though 3 new drug-related charges depend on it. And it seems many jurisdictions in Canada have different rules, provinces, cities, even workplaces. So with all that, is Canada really ready for legal cannabis? Joining me now for an in-depth conversation about the biggest change since Prohibition is Bill Blair, the Minister of Border Security and Organized Crime Reduction, and the man behind this legalization process who's been leading it. Minister Blair, great to have you back on the program.
Thanks very much, Evan. Good morning.
All right, biggest challenge. I mean, you heard me outline those many challenges. The one that lands on your desk, what is the biggest challenge when legalization happens on 12/01 on Wednesday?
Well, you know, we have been working for almost 2.5 years with the provinces and territories, with law enforcement across the country, to implement a very significant regulatory change. And a lot of that authority and regulation will be under the control of the provinces and territories. And so, you know, there is some differences as we move across the country, but I think it's important to recognize next Wednesday we are lifting the criminal prohibition and we begin the process of an orderly implementation. And so, you know, many of the provinces they've all established their new regulations. They've opened some stores. They've indicated to us they'll be opening additional retail outlets in the months in the months to follow. We've spoken to law enforcement. Law enforcement, perhaps for the very first time, has the authorities and the training and the access to the technologies that they need to detect and deter impaired driving. And many of them have been working very hard in getting their people trained and up to speed on this. But as the new regulations now come into effect, police, I believe, will be able to do a much better job in keeping our roadways safe. And so it's a process of implementation, Evan. Okay,
let me just unpack some of the things you said. Police forces have the training and the technology. Again, a lot of police chiefs, and you're a former police chief, say that's not true. The Ottawa police chief says, I am not going to use the Draeger 5000 saliva test because the results are not trustworthy. It doesn't necessarily work in the cold. It takes too long. So there's real confusion just on that. The technology used to measure impairment. So that's a massive, massive gap. Again, I'd have to ask you, why not wait till there's real technology that all of us can trust before you actually legalize?
Evan, quite frankly, I don't know what scientists the chief in Ottawa has consulted, but I know who we've consulted, and it's the Canadian Society of Forensic Sciences Drugs and Driving Committee. We relied on their advice and their recommendations for the setting of standards. We've tested the device. We tested it in 8 different jurisdictions by the police to ensure that it worked in Canadian conditions. It's up to each individual police chief to make a determination as to how he'll prioritize and deploy his resources. But I think I'm mindful that in 2014, all of the police chiefs in Canada unanimously passed a resolution urging the government of Canada to give them access to technologies that was already in use in other countries around the world, in Australia and New Zealand for almost a decade. And they said they needed that technology in order to detect and deter people who were driving while impaired by drugs.
The big issue, Minister, the big issue on that technology is it doesn't work in the cold. And Australia and New Zealand have very different climates than they do in Canada. You know that. And there are stats. I understand you're going to stand by the technology. I understand. You know the technology, but other police chiefs don't trust you on that.
Evan, and you're going to have to sort of listen to the whole explanation. Even the alcohol screening devices that are currently in use and have been in use for decades have a temperature range. Police officers know it's part of the instructions and training on how to use that device to make it effective for the purpose for which it's intended, which is to give police officers reasonable probable grounds to believe there is the presence of those drugs in the system of the driver, and that gives them the grounds to make demands for other tests, including blood toxicity tests and drug recognition expert tests. Right now, for the first time in decades, the police in Canada have the training, the technology, and the authority to deal far more effectively with the problem in Canada that has been a problem. It's been against the law to drive while impaired by drugs since 1925.
Hang on, slow down, Minister. Let me just jump in there. When you say it's a process, I'm worried about the lag time. Are Canadian citizens in danger from, let's say, impaired driving? The police's inability to enforce that? Maybe wrongful enforcement? Well, we're rolling this stuff out. That is the fear.
Rowan, Evan, and the answer is rather simple here. Since 1925, it's been a criminal offense to drive while impaired by drugs. In 2008, the government of Canada passed regulations and legislation that provided for drug recognition experts, and police chiefs right across the country then had to get their people trained. They asked for resources to train them, they didn't get it. We've provided those resources. And in 2016, only 500 drug recognition experts had been trained after 8 years of being lawfully authorized and required on Canadian roadways to keep them safe. We put the resources in and went back to them and said, we've got to do better. And since, in the last 18 months, we've seen a 60% increase in the number of people who are trained as drug recognition experts. So Canadian police services are far more ready today than they have been in decades.
Let me move to another issue, which is just the pot patchwork. Every province, some cities have different bylaws of where people can consume recreational marijuana. Are you concerned that Canadians are going to be frankly baffled by the myriad of different, you could cross a border from Ontario to Quebec, that's different. Then it's different in British Columbia. It's different where you can travel, how old you can be. Every bylaw in every city may be different. Does that confusion concern you at all, Minister?
Well, we've lived with the differences in how certain substances are regulated. I will tell you that every province and territory across this country has nuanced differences in the way in which they regulate the consumption and purchase of alcohol. And so, frankly, it was entirely appropriate, in my opinion, to have federal regulations that control in every aspect the production of cannabis to make sure that whatever is available for sale anywhere in Canada was safe and healthy. But we went to the provinces and territories and we acknowledged and respected their jurisdiction and authority to establish regulations for the distribution and consumption of cannabis. They have all brought forward their regulations, and they are somewhat nuanced and different, but there is a certain consistency, and all of them understand the important need of making sure this drug is not accessible to kids, and they also understand the imperative of displacing the illicit market.